This is the introduction to my novel, It Knows You by No Other Name. It's available on Amazon, Barnes & Noble, iUniverse. So I'm going to try to read the opening section. To understand, you have to remember how a cloud shadow might roll across the Indiana hills on a July afternoon and give you goosebumps in the sudden coolness before the sun returned. You have to remember taking your mother's hand and walking down the hill where you lived to the field with the high weeds and the horses, and then when you looked again, found the same field broken apart into huge boulders of limestone where you and your brother had climbed looking for blasting caps. They built a stadium there with ramps that you could race down on bicycles. Pastures grew houses and yards. Children appeared behind fences. To the east of your street, bulldozers created open ground for trailer courts, which the university rented to married students. The greenhouse where you had played with the florist's son was replaced by a large dormitory. There were fewer and fewer people coming to your family's grocery store. You had sold penny candy to the other kids from behind a pretend counter on the front porch. Your mother had taught you how to skip up and down the aisles after you'd come home in tears from kindergarten, being the only one that didn't know how to skip. You have to remember sitting at a table in the adjoining kitchen while your mother made lunch and watching a pocket knife blade slide out of the crack between the door and the door jamb and unlatch the hook. Al had come to visit your mother. You think she scolded him, but that's vague and you really don't recall any other time he was there. And still you know that that store was closed for good shortly after and somehow he was a part of it. The goods and the shelving were removed and the walls were painted. After the nooks and crannies were gone, as well as the bundles of straw brooms and the cases of orange soda that caught the light from the front windows, there didn't seem to be any secrets left around to be saved, or anywhere to put them if they were. Notes could be slipped down in the upright ends of the brooms or hidden in the dark spaces between bottles. You were left with the whole, with the white, wide walls of the living room you received in exchange, a room that's always seemed empty and chilly in comparison. And when the bulldozers came one final time to remove the last of your neighborhood, your life changed more drastically than you could ever imagine. The events that sent you on away from here were the same events which would bring you flying back 20 years later to stand with these men on the empty land in a little town 50 miles south of Indianapolis. There was no longer any trace of the houses or driveways or fences. Even the old outhouse, which had sat in the far back corner of the lot, was gone. The university, which had been in a rush to build dormitories here, discovered that they weren't needed after all, so the land had gone untouched all this time. The tree remained, the tree you had called the parchment tree when you were a boy. It was a maple that shed its bark in thin furrows that, if removed carefully, could be used to create pirate maps. Without the tree, you wouldn't have been able to direct the deputies where to dig. Had they built here, you might have been found out. Had they built here, what you had come to find might be buried under tons of concrete. So perhaps they had done you a favor. A 20-year reprieve could be a lifetime for some. If the tree had gotten any taller, it might have matched your own growth because it seemed just the same. The man next to you, who had been so imposing at one time, was now smaller. You could see the thinning hair on the top of his head. He had aged well. His thin frame remained as straight as a board, and his jaw was still well defined. He was now the elected sheriff of this county. He eyed you when he thought you weren't looking. You were sure you appeared half dead. You had come straight from the airport in the 6-hour flight and the sleepless night before that. You both watched as the two deputies struggled to dig in the hard ground. There had already been one freeze this autumn. It was cold out of the sun, and you drew in the collar of your windbreaker. Small talk seemed impossible. Why now? Pace asked. He had always been someone to trust. Al knew. You turned to him, suddenly unable to recall if you had told him. He died last week. You looked at your shoes as if embarrassed. You must have told him. Pace accepted the lame excuse without a word, as if Al needed protection from anything. Pace had worked with him and knew him just as well as you did. How was he? Pace asked. He had heart trouble, but he was still getting out. He'd gone to help a neighbor butcher a cow and just fell over. He didn't make it to the hospital. Quick is good. It hadn't been, but you didn't tell him that. Last Christmas, Al had waved off your questions about his blue skin and the chest pains that he had lived with constantly. After dinner, he produced a box of cufflinks and tie tacks and offered them to you. He got mad when you refused them and was about to chew you out when a coughing spell cut him off. He labored to regain his composure and looked at you hard and sat the jewelry box on the floor beside his easy chair. You need to make peace with what happened, you know, he said. You knew exactly what he was talking about. So what do you want of mine, he asked. Your hat. Talk to your mother about that. I'm still wearing it. Such a small legacy, the advice and the hat. His hat had come with you in a brown grocery sack as carry-on. Later, after you were done with Pace and his deputies, it came back with you to Los Angeles. The kids took it down from the shelf and played with it when they were small. The little Indian feathers came out of the brim and it got beat up, but it made you feel as if you were still around somewhere. You would have been the first to take it off and stick it on the head of a 4-year-old. The advice settled into your life as well. He would have said it to you again if he was still around. There had been no references, no comment, no concern for 20 years, and then just one sentence. As if his dreams were disturbed like yours. He never spoke of it. If he had regrets, he didn't let them show. You were certain that your mother was never told. We were happy, weren't we? We had our adventures, our life to enjoy, and now, in the land where they opened graves, he had become the ghost of Hamlet's father, telling you what was still undone. That's what we all become, isn't it? A ghost in the mind's eye of someone who had loved us. Walking off the plane in Kalispell, Montana, on your way to his funeral, you still expected to find him waiting there at the gate, in hat and down vest with his arm around your mother. He had been 6 foot tall. You reached his height at 14, was standing close and grinning in his face when your height was mentioned. But you wouldn't do it now because he seemed to shrink in his late 60s and you didn't want to embarrass him. His belly grew larger with every visit. He always carried an unlit cigar to chew on. The doctor told him he couldn't smoke any longer. But he was dead now. Didn't matter. He wasn't there. They had sent a neighbor lady to meet you. She had made hushed, pleasant comments about the funeral arrangements and the weather while you collected your luggage and followed her to her car. You allowed the conversation to die in the long drive up the winding mountain highway and wondered if Al or your mother had even known this woman other than to wave it to her from their driveway. And you recalled that they knew everyone in the little town. Al had played Santa Claus every Christmas at the local supermarket up until last year.